My name is Bert Dicht. I'm Vice President of Membership from the National Space Society, and also on behalf of Larry Ahern, Vice President of Chapters, we want to welcome you to this evening's NSS Space Forum, Ask an Astronaut, a conversation with Colonel Terry Virts. We're glad to have you here for one of our continuing series of space forums. And as always, I'd like to do a little bit about our etiquette. Now, to submit a question, we're asking all of our participants to use the Q&A function. Only the panelists can see that, and it's a little easier to sort out versus putting a question into the chat, which has a lot of other things in it. So please use the Q&A function for the questions. You can use the chat for some comments or links, things like that. But because everybody can see the chat function, I'm asking you all to be respectful of both the panelists and the audience. Now, there were a lot of questions submitted prior to the event when people registered. We're going to try to get through as many of those as possible, but we have a great list, but please still send those questions in and we'll get it to as many as we can. The program for tonight, I'm going to be doing some announcements first and talking about some upcoming events. This way we can get those all out of the way. It's a little different than what we usually do. And then we'll get right into the program for tonight. And then I think you're really going to enjoy it. So let's go real quick into the announcements. And feel free to take a screenshot of these while we'll be putting these links also in the chat function. But just asking you to follow us and keep connected to what's happening in space. Our NSS website, space.nss.org. Also our new NSS membership portal, which is called Inside NSS. And also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. We're starting to put a lot more information out there, and we will also welcome your comments. So please check frequently. And also, I like to say, if you're enjoying this type of programming, like these space forums and town halls, I urge you, give to our cause, make a donation to support NSS. I can tell you, all of us who organize these programs, we are all volunteers, and we rely, of course, on our membership and the donations of generous members like you. So please feel free to donate. And following the Space Forum, this is the first time we're doing this, I'll ask you just to take a few minutes to fill out a survey. It's very quick. The survey is anonymous. We're just trying to gauge the reaction to all these space forums and town halls, and we're going to be using this information for future planning. And finally, in terms of just the announcements, I want to thank all the members who've expressed interest in volunteering for NSS when you registered for this event and the previous space forums. The turnout was fabulous. A lot of people have put down that they're interested. What we're doing right now is we're preparing a survey. We're going to be sending that out to everybody to let you know about all the different opportunities to get involved and to be part of NSS and be part of our team. So we look forward to doing that, and we look forward to your participation. In terms of what's coming up, very briefly, next week, February 4th on Thursday, we've got the Space Settlement 2021. It's a new virtual free presentation. It's going to showcase people, technologies, organizations related to space settlements. So it is open to everybody. I will be posting the link so you can find out more about it, but you also have the link there where it's going to be seen on E360, on Facebook and YouTube from NSS. Don't miss that exciting event. A lot of content and a lot of great speakers. And finally, 2 weeks from tonight, with our space forum, we are going to have Chris Calley, the famed space artist, who's going to be talking about space history through art. If you're aware of the NASA art program during the Apollo, Chris's father was actually part of that and was actually there when the Apollo 11 astronauts suited up and actually drew some amazing sketches. So you're going to learn all about that. So we look forward to having you participate on the 11th, and then our next Space Forum after that will be on the 25th. We are going to a 2-week program, every 2-week program. So that's it. I appreciate your patience as we went through all those announcements, and now it's time to get right to our program. So it is my pleasure and distinct honor right now to introduce the NSS President, Jeffrey Notkin, who is going to say a few words. So President Notkin, it is all yours.
Thank you, Bert. Distinguished guests, officers, and members of the NSS, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm Jeffrey Notkin, President of the National Space Society, and I extend the warmest of welcomes to this special Ask an Astronaut presentation. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar with the NSS, we're a global, nonpartisan, non-profit organization dedicated to the peaceful exploration, development, and settlement of space. Recognized as the preeminent human presence in space advocacy, we trace our roots back to the early 1970s, and our founder, the brilliant rocket scientist, Dr. Wernher von Braun, his organization later merged with the L5 Society to form today's NSS. If you enjoy this presentation tonight live, or if you're watching it later on our YouTube channel and are not already a member of our organization, I urge you to please visit us online at nss.org and consider becoming part of the exciting mission. Your membership directly helps support educational outreach events like this, and it also helps support the dream of spaceflight and space settlement. Print and digital subscriptions to our beautiful award-winning magazine, Ad Astra Senior, are one of the perks of membership. Before I invite our hosts to take over, I would like to send my comments to Bert Dick, Jeffrey Liss, Larry Ahern, Greg Autry, Fred Becker, and the rest of their team who helped make the Space Forum series possible. This has become one of the NSS's most valuable outreach tools. I know it's become very popular, and I'm very impressed by the professionalism that's been shown in the series and the wonderful guests we have. Now, NSS officers and volunteers comprise a very wide variety of backgrounds. Among us are engineers, educators, attorneys, scientists, authors, filmmakers, but we all have one thing in common, and that is deep down, we are all space nerds. So an extra special treat for us of such an accomplished astronaut as distinguished guest today. On behalf of the Space Society, I'd like to welcome you all to the show. Gentlemen, over to you.
Thank you, President Notkin. And it is now my great pleasure to introduce one of our board members and our Vice President of Space Development, Greg Autry, who is going to kick off our program. Greg, it is all yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much again, Bert and Jeff, for setting this up. And I have to agree with President Notkin that the execution on this series has been fantastic. The interview that Jeff did with Lori Garver a while back, that was great. And I know this is going to be a good evening. I'm particularly excited to have been able to bring my friend Terry to talk to the NSS crew here and reach out beyond that. During 2020, which was frankly a miserable year for so many people, you might have noticed I was under a particular great deal of stress, and one of the great stress relievers for me during that time was being able to talk to Terry Virts on a regular basis. Terry and I talk probably every week and text sometimes daily. And what's really interesting about Terry isn't just his accomplishments, which I get to list in a moment, but he is a brilliant and insightful human being, and you can ask him a question about anything. And I know it's a little off topic, but if anybody gets the chance to ask Terry about something completely out of left field, I bet he has some insights on it that will impress you. As far as the background, Terry was a U.S. Air Force fighter pilot, an astronaut that flew both Soyuz and shuttle. He was an ISS commander, 7 months in space, 3 EVAs, I believe. But what interests me about Terry is what he's done since then. And in particular, when he was an astronaut, he really developed amazing photography and videography skills that he's continued to apply. He's got a beautiful coffee table book, A View from Above. In fact, I've got one here on my shelf. I'm going to pull it out. Let me pitch Terry's book. This is an amazingly gorgeous book to work your way through. The images that Terry took are astounding, and the descriptions are beautiful. Everybody needs this on the coffee table. I get $1 a piece, right, Terry? No, just kidding.
Exactly.
He's also done amazing video National Geographic work. He did a movie recently called One More Orbit, where he did a polar circumnavigation of the Earth in a jet and talks about everywhere he is. He's got a new short film called Cosmic Perspective, which I'm hoping might turn into a TV series. And he speaks regularly, super engaging person. If your organization ever needs a great speaker, you're about to see what that is. I used to think that astronauts were special, different, amazing people, and then I met Terry. Anyway, with no further ado, Terry, thank you so much for being here, and take it away, sir.
Thank you. Thanks, Greg, and thanks for introducing us to Terry, and welcome everybody. And I suppose my first appropriate question is, our guest is, how would you be preferred to be addressed, as Terry or as Colonel?
Terry's good. Terry works.
Terry works, that's fine.
Yeah.
You know, as I look at the virtual Zoom screen behind me, I have the same question as many registrants have asked. What went through your mind when you first saw Earth from space, and then when you turned away and saw the darkness and the stars?
Oh man, the whole the whole first chapter of that book that Greg was talking about is about my 8.5-minute ride into space. The first view I had was about a minute and a half after launch or so. I looked out the window and I could see the moon in front of us, and there was this huge roar of the rocket engines. The vibrations were crazy. It was like somebody grabbed you and just shook you as hard as they could, and we're going towards the moon. It was this surreal moment. And I said, "Hey, Zambo, look over there." And he looked at my commander, George Zamka. And then it was back to flying the shuttle. A few minutes later, the shuttle launched upside down, and it did a roll to heads up maneuver about Mach 13 to point the antennas up towards the TDRS satellites, because we launch with the antennas pointed at the ground. And it's a roll of the dice. You don't know if it's going to roll right or left, but I was in the right seat, and it rolled in the direction so that I could look out the window and see the Earth. Zambo looked up and saw black. And when it did that, I saw I-95 from Georgia up through Maryland, up through Boston. I grew up in Maryland. I grew up driving up and down I-95 to vacation in the summertime and stuff. And it was like just a second or two, and I thought, holy crap, there's I-95. Like, I didn't expect to see that. And then it just, every moment for that 8.5 minutes, flying into the first sunrise. We launched at 4 a.m, so it was dark in the wintertime. Going over the North Atlantic, we showed up into the first sunrise, and it was that blue band of the Earth. You can sort of see it in the Zoom picture behind you there. I've got pictures that I took on the wall here behind me, but you can see a sunrise up right above my shoulder. And I was so blown away by that look. Today, I was thinking about it. Sometimes I can close my eyes and just take myself back to space. And I remember seeing that color of blue, and I remember thinking, wow, I've never seen that shade of blue before, which was a really surprising. I didn't expect that. But anyway, I could go on and on. I had 7 months of these moments where 99% of what I was doing was work. And every once in a while you look outside and you see something that I try to describe. I've written books, I've done movies. I'm trying to share the experience, but until you see it yourself, you really can't get the full experience.
Has being in space sort of changed the way you view things?
I hope so. So I think, there's a couple of things that have changed about me. I hope anyway. I think I'm a lot less of a black and white person. It's easy when you're young to, be right or left or whatever, you know what's right, you know what's wrong. And when I'm after going in space, it's like, I'm just not as uptight about things. I can see both sides of issues. When you see the Earth and like, you're not on it, like your planet is over there and you're in space, that's a profound change. And it's just hard to get uptight about, or hard to be impressed by celebrity, or get too uptight about the latest politician yelling about whatever they're yelling about. Because the Earth's been around for billions of years. It's going to be around for billions of years. And it puts the problems that we have in perspective. Even COVID, as terrible as it is, I was talking with a friend today. It's like, it's been worse than World War II, but it's going to be gone in a few years, and 100 years from now, it'll be ancient history, and 10,000 years from now, no one will remember it. So I think having that, less black and white and not getting too stressed out about things. I've got a lot of other stories about that, but hopefully that's how I've changed.
Has being in space changed you physically? And if so, are those changes likely to be permanent?
Well, one of the cool things about being in space is that you grow. So like right now, gravity is smashing me down, but in space, you kind of stretch out. So I was finally 6 feet tall. There's a tape measure. When I was there was a tape measure taped to the wall in node 1. And, but now I'm back to 5'10". The doctors told me it happened within a couple hours of getting back to Earth. So that's one change that happens. Your eyeballs change. I think it's because of fluid shift, the shape of your lens changes. So
yeah,
it's harder to read things close to you, but easier to read things farther away. But that, for me, that shifted back to the way it was before. There's lots of changes that happen. I'm just a fighter pilot. I'm not a doctor, but there's lots of changes. But the one I think that's really dangerous is radiation. And so, your DNA is getting irradiated by radiation that doesn't exist on Earth. Unless there's a nuclear explosion. And so, and NASA really doesn't know how that affects us. And so we'll see. The good news is, for the most part, astronauts are okay when they come back, but there's probably some increase in the likelihood of cancer. And who knows, the other really interesting thing is that the atmosphere on the station is really full of carbon dioxide. We have machines to scrub it, but they're not nearly as good as trees are. We have a pretty good life support system down here on Earth. It's pretty well designed, I think. So you're living in a CO2 soup for months and months and months, and no one knows how that affects your brain over the long term, or your heart, or who knows what. So there's still some unknowns, but I'm in good shape. I'm healthy. I get my skin cancer treatment every year, and they clean me up, and I'm doing all right.
But to what extent does NASA monitor changes in astronauts' physical condition over their lifetimes?
That's a very good question. You would think a lot, but the reality is they bring former astronauts back to if you want to, you can come back for an annual checkup. It's like going to see your doctor, and they, monitor your blood pressure and your vision and just basic stuff. They'll do a heart stress test every once in a while, but it's just a basic physical. So whatever you remember, you can tell them and they'll write down. But they don't actually care for astronauts, or they don't get all of our medical data or whatever. So I think that's a real giant hole in the human spaceflight program, is that there's not a comprehensive study of astronaut health, because they simply don't check up on that. And that was kind of a big surprise after I flew. I assumed that there would be, but there is, to the extent that all of these people in their 50s and 60s and 80s can remember every single medical event that happened for the year. But obviously that's a pretty imperfect set of data.
Jeffrey, I hate to interrupt
Yes.
you for a second. Could you just make sure you're close to the mic? It was
Sure.
a little intermittent.
Sure.
Thank you.
Good enough. So you're telling me, as we spend millions and billions to send people into space, but we have no longitudinal study of how it may have affected them long term?
There is actually something called there was something called the longitudinal study of astronaut health. I think it ran out of money, but the way that they study that health is just by the memory of the astronauts the ones who choose to come back to Houston from Minnesota or California or Maryland, or wherever they happen to be. So it's definitely an imperfect set of data. And if you don't have a complete set, if you don't know every time an astronaut gets a cold, and every time they, break their toe, and every time everything, then you're not going to catch what may be some interesting effects of astronaut health. And so, yes, that's a long answer, but the short answer is yes.
Well, I'd like to correct something you said. You said you're just a fighter pilot. But I point out, in addition to graduating from the U.S. Air Force Academy, you also graduated from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University and Harvard Business School, which leads me to this question. In general, what do retired astronauts do after being grounded back on Earth? And in particular, what are you planning on doing with your life, besides talking to us?
Doing National Space Society talks. So there's no one typical thing. I have a neighbor who's my astronaut classmate. He's a pilot for United Airlines, and he does some space consulting on the side. So the pilots sometimes go back to the airlines. Sometimes they stay in government. They stay at NASA as managers or other government agencies. A lot of the folks are PhDs, and so they go back to academia and teach. A few folks go on to work at Boeing or Lockheed or something like that, work in the private sector. So there's really astronauts come from a broad variety of careers. They spend a decade or so at NASA, and then they go back to a broad variety. So for me, what I plan on doing, I'm going to try to avoid having a job as long as I can. I've kind of, excuse me, I've had this cough. It was really bad when I was in space. Actually, it's a chronic cough. It's not COVID. But I'm going to try and partition my life into two different aspects. One is like film and TV and books. I've got a new book out right now called How to Astronaut, and that's been kind of my big focus. I just finished a kid's book. Excuse me. I really want to have a kid's book. And I wrote the last chapter. It's going to be called Ask an Astronaut, 101 questions. And I finished question 101 today. So I want to do writing. I want to do film and TV. Like you said, I got to direct a feature documentary last year, which was amazing. One More Orbit. That's out. It's so cool to have a movie out on iTunes and Amazon and stuff like that. That was really fun. And then I made this short film this year that I'm hoping to turn into a TV show. So I've got that side of kind of film and TV and writing. And then the other part of my life that I want to do is business. I'm really interested in business, especially helping startups. A space manufacturing company just asked me to be on their board, and I'm super excited. It's a bunch of 30-somethings that were at SpaceX and some other startups, and they started their own company, and I think they're going to be really successful. There's a green energy company that I'm working with and a graphene company that I'm really excited about. So I like that. I like the idea of trying to help, some businesses get going, especially in the tech fields.
Here's a bunch of related questions from a lot of registrants. I'll just read them. A 10th grade student from India asked, please give me some important advice because I also want to be an astronaut. Another asked, what recommendations might you have for future aspiring astronauts? Another, which fields of science lead more easily to the profession of astronaut? A recent college graduate with a degree in physics asked, what advice do you have for finding opportunities in space? So in general, what advice would you give them?
Yeah. The one piece of advice, kind of the career lesson learned that I have, and I talk about this and when I do speaking and other things, is don't tell yourself no. For me personally, growing up, I want to be an astronaut, and everybody knew that. And I was lucky; my parents really supported me. They allowed me to do things on my own and learn on my own. But a lot of your friends will be like, okay, that's great. No one actually gets to be an astronaut. You should go be an accountant or something. And I finally ended up at test pilot school, which is where everybody who wants to be an astronaut who's a pilot goes to test pilot school. And while I was there as a student, I just showed up. NASA decided that they were going to have an astronaut class. And so I went ahead and applied, even though I was a student, and everybody there said, oh, you're never going to get accepted. You're never going to get accepted. And so I said, you're right. I'm not going to get accepted. This other guy's got better experience. This other guy's better looking than you are, whatever. But I didn't care. I went ahead and applied anyway. Long story short, I got picked, and my friends who really were smarter, they really were higher up in the class than me. They really were better looking than me. They didn't get picked because they took themselves out of the running. And so that was a big lesson learned for me. Like, hey, if you want to do something, go for it. And then you can't just say that you want to be an astronaut. There's a lot of work that has to go into that. You can't just say you want to be a medical doctor, right? You have to take the MCAT and you have to get certain grades and you have to, to do a lot of things before you get to do that. So if there's something that you want to do, figure out what it is, figure out what the path is to get there, and then go for it. And don't tell yourself no.
So in other words, there are a lot of different paths coming astronaut. You just want to be very good at what you chose.
Yeah, there are different paths. So you are really difficult to hear right now, by the way, Jeffrey. I don't know if it's just, yeah, that's a lot better. So there are different paths. You can be, I think NASA chops it into 5 blocks. If I remember, the last thing I did there was help select the class of 2017. There's pilots, there's engineers, there's scientists, there's medical doctors, and so and there's a helicopter engineer category. So they do kind of break it up. But the one thing in common at NASA anyway is that you need a technical degree if it's engineering or science or medicine. You know, you can have an English major, but you also have to have a electrical engineering or something like that. I was a applied math was my undergraduate major, but I also minored in French, which is a really weird combination. I guess you can see that in my career today, where I'm doing, you know, technical business stuff, but also trying to write and do film and TV. I like kind of right brain and left brain. But the minimum is that you have a technical degree in undergrad.
Well, how relevant was your experience as an Air Force fighter pilot for your later space activities? And do you think there ought to be at least one person with that experience on every space mission?
I do think so. I think there's something very important about aviation. Even astronauts who are, you know, engineers or scientists in the past, when they come to NASA, they get T-38 training to fly in the backseat, and many of them have private pilot's licenses. Flying is the best analog and the best training and best preparation for space. Even though in space you're not taking off and landing and doing those things, there's something about the mental aspect of flying where your body is at risk. You know, if you crash, you die, and the airplane's moving fast, and you have to think ahead of it. You have to stay ahead of the jet, is what we called it in the Air Force. There's a lot of analogs between flying and flying in space. I think that's one of the most important qualifications for anybody, engineer, scientist, or pilot, is to have a good aviation experience before you come to NASA.
Can you explain why it takes so long to train an astronaut for every single different mission?
We're slow.
Got that.
Well, you know, the real answer to how long does it take to train is your whole life. I mean, I started training to be an astronaut when I was 5 years old, and I read a book about Apollo, and I haven't stopped ever since then. I'm still learning new things. But on the shuttle, the shuttle itself was really complicated. As a pilot, flying that thing was amazing. It was the highlight of my career as a pilot, but it was also really tough. I didn't appreciate it at all until I got to NASA, what an amazing and complicated flying machine the shuttle was. But on the shuttle, everybody kind of had their job. On the space station, everybody has every job. You know, you have to fly the Soyuz or the Boeing or the SpaceX. They're much simpler. They're 1,000 times simpler than the space shuttle, but you have to pilot. There's a robotic arm that you have to know how to do robotics and fly the robotic arm. You have to know how to do spacewalks. You have to know how to do medicine. At least some astronauts do. I was the crew medical officer, so I was like the doc on our mission. You have to know how to run the TV cameras and video and set up little mini studios. And all the experiments you have to do and all the maintenance you have to do to be able to fix stuff. So everybody kind of has to be a jack of all trades, which was really my favorite part of being an astronaut, was getting to do more than one thing.
It sounds, if I may use the word Navy in this conversation, it sounds like a nuclear submariner has to pretty much master all the elements of the boat before he could be qualified.
Yeah, there's a lot of similarities between submarine life. In fact, some of the same equipment we use in space as submariners use down here on Earth.
Yeah, these two questions may be the same because in your book, there's a picture of you celebrating your 100th day in space, floating down a module with a gigantic ear-to-ear grin. What does microgravity feel like, and what was the most fun you had in space?
Well, what is it like to float is a great question. And what it feels like is that you're falling, because that's actually what is happening. You're falling. And I know this is a very space savvy technical crowd, so everybody knows this, but even at the altitude of the station, it's about 400 kilometers up. Earth's gravity is still very strong. It's almost 90% of what it is down here on the surface. So if you were just sitting there and you dropped a ball, it would fall towards the center of the gravity almost as fast as it does now if I drop a ball. The difference is you're moving forward, right? 17,000 miles an hour, 8 kilometers a second. So as you fall and move forward, that if you're at the right speed, that shape of that curve is an orbit, and it should roughly match what the shape of the Earth is. But it just feels like you're falling, and there's a whole learning curve. It's a pretty steep learning curve, and it goes up for several weeks, if not a month or two. It depends on the person. before you really get good at moving and rotating at the same time, keeping track of your stuff. You know, if you've got, I got a wrench here. And if I wanted to throw you a wrench, if I threw it now, it would do that. It would go up because our brains have, you know, been working for 30 or 40 or 50 years learning that there's gravity. And if you throw something, you got to aim high. Baseball players, when the pitcher aims at the catcher's mitt, he's not aiming at the catcher's mitt. He's aiming 6 inches above the catcher's mitt, and the ball, because his brain knows the ball's going to drop. And that doesn't happen in space. And so you have to rewire your neurons to figure that out, which is a pretty cool process.
And the most fun you had in space?
Taking pictures and filming. I had a chance to film an IMAX movie called A Beautiful Planet, which, by the way, is a great movie if you get a chance to watch it. I think it was out on Hulu. Disney put it out on Hulu for streaming during COVID, but it was Tony Meyer's last space movie. I'm sure a lot of folks here have seen many of the space IMAX movies. When I was a kid, I saw a movie called To Fly, which was like the coolest thing I've ever seen. It was just a great movie.
Remember that?
I think they still play it at the Air and Space Museum. And so I got a chance to help film, and with Tony teaching me and a guy named James Nyhouse, who's my director of photography, he did a lot of Tony's space IMAX movies. I think she did 7 over her, 40-year career. Unfortunately, she just passed away last year from cancer, but it was really fun. I love Tony, and she was my motivation. I dedicated One More Orbit to her. So getting to film that movie was probably my funnest thing that I did.
We've had a lot of similar questions that are really well covered in your book, How to Be an Astronaut. But perhaps you could describe briefly what everyday life on board the ISS was like.
So, yeah, I did talk about that in the book. There's a couple common things that every day has. A normal workday starts at about 7:30, and we use GMT, so London time. We set our mega watches to GMT. And 7:30, there's a conference call with Houston and Moscow and Huntsville, Alabama, which is where our payload center is, Europe and Japan. We get our marching orders for the day. We spend the next 12 hours working, exercising, doing experiments, whatever it is we're going to do for that day. And then roughly 7 p.m. at the end of the workday, we have another conference call. They're called DPCs, or daily planning conferences, the morning DPC and the evening DPC. And you pass on, hey, Houston, when I swapped out this piece of equipment, it was serial number 1092. And then they'll say, hey, tomorrow, get ready to do this, whatever. It's just you passing information, and then you're done. And then usually I would make my dinner and float down to the Russian segment and try and hang out with those guys, because it's very easy for them to do their thing. We do our thing. We never see each other. So I would try and spend time with them in the evenings, and we would laugh. They would teach me bad words in Russian. We would, watch TV, watch the Russian TV or whatever. And then I had a pocket full of CF cards from the cameras that I've been taking pictures all day. So then I would run down to my laptop, and I didn't have anybody on Earth helping me. So we had Picasso was our software when I was there. So I'd had to download the pictures and look at them and click, I'm feeling lucky, and touch them up. And then I'd email them to a guy on Earth who was tweeting stuff for me. I'd say, hey, tweet this picture of Africa. Hey, tweet this sunrise or whatever. And then by that time it was midnight or after midnight, and I had to, go to bed and do it all again the next day.
Well, I think maybe at this time, if the images are clear enough, Bert, could we show on the screen the table of contents from Terry's book so people can get some quick idea of what he's covered, and maybe it might even make a screen capture of it if they want to look at more leisurely? Is that possible? Do we have that? There we go. Can we make that bigger? No, that's not it. Yeah.
Oh, wow. I like some of the names of those chapters, or some of them are kind of funny.
Yeah, I thought they were pretty cool. I really enjoyed reading that book.
The goal that I had for this book was it's not necessarily for space nerds. It's for anybody, for men and women, old and young. I had 2 goals: was A, to make you laugh, and B, to make you say, wow. And a lot of the stuff you already know, or you'd expect to, how to do emergencies in a space shuttle or how to do spacewalks. That stuff's expected. Hopefully there were some chapters that were unexpected. And I did try, and those are the two goals, to laugh and to say, wow.
Yeah, well, I'll say this. I know a lot about space, but I wasn't bored when I read it.
Good. That's good. I appreciate that.
A number of persons have asked, what was your scariest experience in space? And I suppose for your book, one possible answer is the day of the ammonia leak, the U.S. segment,
Yeah,
which you very vividly describe in your book. Could you briefly explain what happened? And then I have a follow-up question.
Sure. So there's a few different types of emergencies that we train for. One is an air leak, which makes sense. One is fire, which makes sense. And one is, we call it toxic atmosphere, but that really means ammonia. Ammonia is the cooling fluid on the American segment. The Russians use glycol, which is like sugar water. It's not as good or as efficient of a coolant as ammonia is, but it has one advantage, is that it doesn't kill you dead. The NASA trainers would tell us in training that, hey, if you ever smell ammonia, you don't have to worry about running this procedure because you're going to die. So ammonia is a pretty deadly chemical. If anybody works in the oil and gas industry or chemical industry anywhere, you know that ammonia is bad news. And so you have air leak alarms every once in a while. There's been a few in the news the last couple of years. The fire alarm goes off every month, if not more than that, especially on the Russian segment. When those guys clean, dust kicks up and it gets in their smoke detectors, and you get an alarm. So you get it, you treat it like it's real, but you know it's not, and you go about your business. Well, this one day, the toxic atmosphere, it's called ATM, went off, and Samantha and I were both working. We popped our heads out, and I was looking at it, and I was like, atmosphere, is that a leak? Because in my brain, I'm like, that can't be ammonia. The ammonia alarm doesn't go off. And she was like, nope, that's ammonia. And so you have to put on an oxygen mask. You go to the Russian segment and shut the hatch because they don't have ammonia. And we went through this whole process. We finally got the masks off, and we looked at each other like, okay, this sucks. And then a few minutes later, Houston called and said, hey, that was a false alarm. You can go back. So we were like, wow, that's just killed our day, because everything is floating. We're going to have to spend hours reconfiguring the station, because when the alarm goes off, a bunch of valves close and stuff gets powered off, and the computer basically does a big time shutdown of the space station when that happens. So we're cleaning up the stuff that's left floating, and all of a sudden the Capcom got on the radio. This was not an alarm going off, but this was Jim Calley, Vegas, calling us saying, execute emergency response. This is a real ammonia leak. This is not a drill. Execute emergency response. So we were like, crap. So we just grabbed the masks that we still had, put it on, made sure we didn't leave anybody behind, went down the Russian segment, closed the hatch. There's 2 hatches that you have to close. What you're supposed to do is close one, take your clothes off, because if you get ammonia gas on it, and it'll kill people in the Russian segment. So you take your clothes off, then you close the next hatch. So after we got through the first hatch, we all kind of looked at each other like, I didn't smell anything. Did you? No, I didn't smell anything. So we kept our clothes on, which was wrong. But anyway, we did it. And then we spent the whole day staring at each other like, guys, the station's going to die. Because if that really happens, the station dies. It would probably take a few weeks to completely kill it. But either so much would leak that it would pop the hull. If you get ammonia on the walls, you can never clean it in space. And it was just a real disaster. And in the middle of Crimea and Ukraine and sanctions and all the mess that's been happening between America and Russia, which all that started when I was in training, the Russian prime minister called us up and said, hey, American colleagues, you can stay as long as you want. We're going to work this out. It was a really great moment of international cooperation in an otherwise really dismal period of Russia and the West. So that was the big lesson there, that it was kind of an example of how humans can and should work together when otherwise we don't. And then at the end of the day, Houston called us up and said, hey, just kidding, it was a false alarm. But
which is fortunate.
But when you go back, put your mask on just in case when you do to sample to make sure there's no ammonia. So it was really eerie. It was like the Alien movie, going into this deserted spaceship, and there was like stuff was still just floating around. It was like a ghost ship. It was pretty cool.
Well, here's the way I reacted when I read that in your book. Given that after the Apollo 1 fire, and the U.S. changed from an all-oxygen atmosphere in the Apollo capsules to a safer one, why did the U.S. opt to use an ammonia coolant rather than a glycol-based coolant like the Russians did? Do you know the reasons for the choice?
You know, excuse me, that choice was made in the 90s. It was a Boeing decision. I'm assuming if you use a less efficient coolant, you're going to have more of it. It's going to weigh more. It's going to cost more, or whatever. They have a really strong a wall of separation between outside and inside, and so it's going to be really hard for the ammonia to leak into the inside portion of the station. And so I don't know the exact engineering trade-off, but I'm sure if you use something that's not as good, you're going to need more of it, and therefore it's going to be more massive and therefore more expensive and might break more often or whatever. Thankfully, knock on wood, that's never happened. It was just a false alarm, but it's definitely one that gets our attention.
Of course, I must observe, that unlikely is not the same as never.
Right.
So let me ask you this question. The ISS has a U.S. segment, it has a Russian segment, and each reports to the people Earthside, and each mission has a commander. So when push comes to shove with some condition, who gets to make the final decision as to what the crew is to do or not to do? Right. Supposedly in an actuality.
Exactly. So on a day-to-day basis, there's somebody called the flight director, and he or she is the person in charge of the mission. They're in mission control in Houston. When you watch Apollo 13, FIDO, go. GPO, go. Capcom, tell the crew we're go. That's the flight director, Gene Kranz with the little vest on. And they're the person in charge of the mission. There's a Russian flight director and a Houston flight director. In theory, Houston is the overall lead for the space station vehicle. If there's some big emergency on the Russian side, then they'll take charge of that. So the flight director is in charge of the mission, but the commander is the final say, right? In space, what if you don't have communication? The commander's in charge. If there's an emergency, the commander's in charge. If something is happening and there's no time to talk about it, the commander's in charge. Just like an airline pilot. Air traffic control tells you where to go, tells you what altitude, tells you when you're allowed to land. But when the engine catches on fire, the captain makes the decisions and he points the jet where it needs to go. And, I've had many examples of that where there was no time to ask permission from someone who doesn't know what's happening and can't help you anyway. You just have to make it happen. So the commander has ultimate authority, but the reality is you've got the flight director, and not only do you have the flight director, you've got all these 15 different nations, right? And there's NASA, and there's Roscosmos, and there's the Japanese Space Agency, and there's the European Space Agency, and there's the Canadian Space Agency, and they all have politicians in all those places. So there's lots and lots and lots of fingers in the pie. It really is a collaborative organization. There's not just one person who can make things happen.
You mentioned that you got medical training before your flight. Do all astronauts get the medical training, or how many of them ought to be medically trained for any long flight, do you think?
Yeah, so I think we have to have 2 CMOs per flight, crew medical officer. I'm not sure what the requirement is. Everybody gets basic medical training, like how to handle a heart attack, or how to draw blood and that kind of stuff. I actually did a program above and beyond that. I got to spend a week at the local Houston Medical Center, which was amazing. I absolutely fell in love with it. I got to work in the ER and an OR, in an eye clinic. I did stitches and wrapped burn wounds. And unfortunately, in Houston, the nation's 4th biggest city, there's every type of injury imaginable. So I got to treat actual patients coming in with problems. I had a cadaver. So me and my group of 2 other astronaut trainees, we had our own cadaver, which was amazing. And part of that, I think the big part of that training is just to get you over the ooh and the ick factor, right? Like get you used to blood and that kind of thing. But that training for me, I loved it and was really, really valuable. So in space, we have a small pharmacy. So everybody would come to me, hey, I need some whatever, ibuprofen, or I was like handing out, medicine to crew members.
And so on your resume, you can add pill pushing, right?
And I was our crew dentist. So I went to the
Oh,
UT dental school here in Houston, and I learned how to pull teeth and do fillings. And I actually had to do a filling for one of my crewmates in space, which is pretty cool. I think we think it was the first ever filling in space.
but here's a question which is enjoyable to ask, but hard to contemplate the answer. With live animal experiments in microgravity, how do you deal with the animals' waste products?
Yeah, we call it rodent research. There's mice in space. A friend of mine is really involved in that. They're on, I think, the 22nd group of mice that were launched. When I was there, it was the second. We did rodent research number 2. But these mice, they launch as these cute little female mice. And I remember they were there for like a month. And then I went in to check on them. And holy cow, man, they got big. They weren't rat size, but they were really scary. And at first they're floating around confused, but man, after not long, they figure out, and they run around just like on a habit trail, like in a little loop. And
Yep.
they figure out if you run on the bottom and run on the wall and run on the ceiling, they just give themselves centrifugal force. And they really figure out how to fly in space. But they're animals, so they make a mess, and it's pretty simple. There's vacuums and filters, just like for people. The airflow sucks everything into the filter, and every once in a while you have to change the filter out. But there's no, bathroom for them to go to. They just go and the filter sucks it all out.
Yeah. I'll leave it to people to read your book to discover how you deal with other messes. But here's a quick and much more pleasant question. My 6-year-old asks whether it is possible to have carbonated beverages in space.
I've got my San Pellegrino right now. And the answer, unfortunately, is no. You could have it, but it would just fizz everywhere and it would make a mess. On Earth, gravity keeps the carbonation from shooting out. In fact, one of the cool videos I did, and I think a lot of astronauts do this, you make a ball of water and you just slowly squirt water out, and it slowly turns into this wiggling, jiggling ball of, it's like Jello, but it's water. And I took an Alka-Seltzer tablet, and if you just slowly float it up there, it'll just boom, it'll stick to it with surface tension. So you have to throw it hard, and then it hits it, and it shoots into the middle, and then it fuzzed up. And so I had this carbonated ball of water orbiting, shooting just random water in all different directions. It was pretty cool, but it was a good visual of why you can't have Coke or beer or something like that that's carbonated.
Well, let me for a moment shift gears from the past to the future, a little more serious questions. With all your experience, if you were to be magically anointed as NASA administrator under existing statutes, what changes, if any, would you make in how NASA is organized or functions?
That's a great question. I think one of the things that, and I've talked to NASA administrators before about this, that they all would like to do would be to make it more efficient. It's a government organization, and God bless our founding fathers, but they gave us these things called congressional districts. And that means that a lot of what happens at NASA is not because it's the best way to get to the moon. It's because there's jobs in, pick your state, there's 10 NASA centers, so pick one of the 10 locations that need to be protected. And so there's a lot of that inefficiency that you have to figure out how to do it better. The military has this process called BRAC, the Base Realignment Commission, and usually about once a decade they'll have a BRAC, and they'll shut down 5 or 10 or 20 military bases. Since the 70s, the DoD is probably half the size it used to be or less. It's a bipartisan commission. It's a separate commission so that there's plausible deniability, so that when the congressmen lose their base, I didn't do it, they did it. They have that. NASA doesn't have that. Since the 70s, the DoD has gone from whatever, they've cut in half. Since the 70s, NASA's been the same. And so there's a lot of institutional inefficiency there. I know one NASA administrator was really a very smart person, and he told me, he said, Terry, yeah, it would make more sense if there were less centers. So the president could spend all of his political capital and spend 4 years fighting fights and making enemies and shut down 2 centers. But no president is going to want to do that. There's other things that they want to do. So we need to figure out how to just take what we have and then help those people at the NASA centers do productive work and not just the kind of keep the lights on work that they have. So that's
Which is-
one. That's one. There's many things, but that's one.
Well, it's a nice segue to probably the most popular question you may get these days. What is your opinion about the SLS, the Space Launch System?
So the SLS was born as Ares 5 during the Constellation program. So back in 2004, back in 2003, unfortunately, this week, February 1st, Columbia was destroyed. It was, if you've ever read the Challenger, what happened on Challenger, the same thing happened on Columbia. It just was 17 years later, and it was all the same stuff. The technical reason was different, but the management problems were the same. And after that, there was a big hand wringing, like, are we going to keep on flying humans in space? What are we going to do? And so the president gave the speech, vision for space exploration. And the bottom line was, we're going to finish building the space station. We're going to start off with a small, inexpensive, human-rated, safe capsule to take people to low Earth orbit. We're going to make a bigger unmanned rocket that's going to take the moon ship or the Mars ship or whatever it is into space. And then initially we'll start with going to the ISS and then going to the moon as a testing ground, eventually onto Mars. So it laid out a build-up approach, and we started building rockets and capsules and spaceships that were designated for a mission. And the big rocket was called Ares 5. It was going to use some space shuttle parts because the space shuttle contractors were there, the welding machines were there, whatever. It was supposed to be, an efficient, cheaper version of a big space shuttle. And then when the new administration came in 2009, they didn't like that program, so they canceled it. The week I flew into space, which was a very stressful time because it was nerve-wracking, because everybody at KSC just had their jobs canceled. They were afraid. And I'm like, forget about that, guys. Just make sure Endeavor's ready to go. That's all I cared about. But they did, and they were very professional, and they handled that very stressful time really well. So the Ares 5, so when they canceled Constellation, they didn't cancel Constellation. The Orion capsule survived, and the big rocket survived. They changed the name from Ares 5 to SLS. The only thing that really got canceled was Ares 1, which was a smaller human-rated rocket. And they had to cancel that in order to allow SpaceX to have a reason to launch people into space. So they had to kill Ares 1 for that. So in the context of all of that, the SLS was really born in 2005. We've been spending $3 billion a year on it for years and years, and maybe over a decade. The eventual goal is to fly it maybe once a year, maybe once every other year. The decision was made by that administration also to replace the cheaper RS-68 engines that Ares 5 was going to have with the Space Shuttle main engine, which is the most expensive rocket ever made. That made a lot of sense. There was this big budget gap. I was the SLS rep from the astronaut office. There was a big budget gap. And in order to fill that budget gap, they used Space Shuttle engines because we had 14 or 15 of them laying around. That's great for the first 3 flights. And then after that, you're throwing away 4 or 5 of the most expensive rocket engines ever made every time. The solid rocket boosters that we used to recover on the Space Shuttle, they decided they're just going to let them throw those away. So you're making these big million-pound big rockets that you're throwing away every time. So I'm saying all that to say it became really, 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 really expensive. And on top of all that, because they had canceled Ares 1, they had to put the Orion capsule on top of the SLS rocket. Well, the Orion capsule, when it's full of rocket fuel, is like 70,000 pounds. It's a really heavy, very heavy capsule, and it takes up almost all the payload. So a fully loaded Orion means you can't have a big moonship or anything like that. So this is turned into something that's extremely expensive. It'll probably be 20 years between when the rocket was born and when it first flies with humans. And when it first flies with humans, it's only going to be half of an SLS because the upper stage is still going to be a Delta upper stage. They still don't have the EUS upper stage for the SLS yet. So it's just an extremely expensive rocket that, because Orion has to be on it, is very, very limited in capability. And the flight rate is going to be something that's very limited in usefulness. You could do a moon launch every year or two, but you can't really have a Mars program with that level. So So I'm hopeful that rockets like New Armstrong and Falcon Heavy and the BFR and other private competitors can help out in the heavy lift, because to have a viable deep space human program, you have to have a heavy lift rocket. But man, the SLS is unfortunately, I loved it when it was with Constellation and the way they had it in Ares 5, but it's not a sustainable way to have a successful human space program, I don't think, today in its current config.
NASA's Artemis program is intended to land Americans on the moon again, possibly as early as 2024. The Lunar Gateway is planned space station in lunar orbit intended to serve as a major role in the Artemis program. What is your opinion of the Artemis program, and in particular of the Gateway?
You and I had a long conversation about this the other day. So the Artemis program in general, I'm glad we're doing that. I'm a big fan of Jim Bridenstine's. I think he did a great job at NASA in an era of the worst partisanship in American history. I think he handled that role really well, and I think he needs a lot of kudos for getting Artemis going. But the Gateway, and I was asked to speak at the National Space Council at the White House 2 years ago about Gateway. I had written op-eds about it, how I'm not in favor of it. And Scott Pace, who was running the National Space Council, who's probably one of the best and smartest space people in the world for sure, knew exactly how I felt. We had had long talks about it. And he still invited me to go speak and to tell the vice president that what NASA's doing is a bad idea, which is what I told him. And I really, really appreciated that willingness of Scott Pace, to have a dissenting opinion, come to the White House and say, the baby's ugly. But the problem with Gateway is it's not a mission-driven vehicle. In Constellation, we said, all right, we're going to the moon, so we'll build this rocket and this capsule and this lander, and we built our equipment to meet the mission. Gateway was born when they canceled Constellation. We had Orion and SLS, so what are you going to do with them? And a friend of mine, he said, Terry, headquarters just called me and they need something to do with Orion and SLS. So they asked me to come up with it. So on his whiteboards in his office at the Johnson Space Center was Gateway. This is about 6 years ago. And it's a genius. It's a great concept. It's a really great system if the goal is to provide SLS and Orion with something to do. It allows international partners to build modules just like they did for the ISS, and it gives Gateway and Orion something to do. It's a really good system for that. If your goal is actually to land on the moon, it adds billions and billions of dollars and decades or years at a minimum to actually landing on the moon. So I'm not a fan. I guess we could go on and on about that, but for those who don't know, Gateway is essentially a small mini ISS. It's a couple modules that we'll build just like we built the ISS, only it'll be in orbit around the moon. But again, Apollo 11 and the Apollo program didn't have a Gateway, and they did pretty well getting to the surface back in the 60s. So if the goal is to go to the moon, Gateway just gets in the way and slows you down. If the goal is to go to Mars, I don't think you really want to go to orbit around the moon on your way to Mars. So that's my take on Gateway.
A little closer to home, what are your views on the International Space Station and how it ought to evolve in the future? And do you have any ideas of what kind of space stations, if any, should succeed in Earth orbit?
So I think the ISS has been an amazingly successful program. We've been able to build it. We've been able to operate it very well for 20 years now. NASA's figured out how to operate it pretty efficiently. It still costs a couple $2 billion a year, but for that, you get a 1 million pound spaceship, you get a multinational effort. And in an era where there's not a lot of cooperation happening down here on the planet, that's one bright spot of our cooperation. I think besides the engineering and the science, just having a place where people get along has been pretty profoundly good. And some of the science they're just science projects, and some of the science is really good. And so the ability to do science, it's a national lab in orbit. It's subsidized. Obviously, it's heavily subsidized by the government, but that's a good thing. And there's been a few important discoveries on the station. One of them is me. Like the space station has figured out that people can live and work in space in weightlessness for a long time. And when I came back to Earth, my bone density had changed 0%. Most astronauts lose some bone density, but they're not, deathly ill or anything like that. If you do your exercise every day, you come back in good shape and you have strength. I did 20 pull-ups the week I got back after 200 days in space. So the station has shown that people can live and work in space. So the science that we do there is good and people get along. It's not an efficient manufacturing facility. It never will be. I hope one of the follow-ons is manufacturing. I think that that's something that there's different materials that you can make in weightlessness that you can't make on Earth. And if we figure out how to do that efficiently, that's one of the many low Earth orbit economies that can come from the space station. We're never going to build another ISS. Like we're never going to build another space shuttle. There's never going to be, I don't think, a vehicle as big as the ISS. But that's okay. I think it can eventually evolve into other more mission driven. Like we need this manufacturing facility. Bob Bigelow was trying to do that, build manufacturing facilities in orbit. So I think that's how it's going to morph in the future, but I hope we fly it for a while. It would be a shame to waste this, and again, I often talk about the sunk cost fallacy and how you need to leave sunk costs in the past and only worry about the future. But I'm going to contradict myself and say, it would be a shame to waste the space station after we put this much effort into it.
What do you think about the public-private partnerships like the COTS, Commercial Orbit Transportation Services, Commercial Resupply, Commercial Crew? In particular, do you think they should be used to build the human-class lunar landers?
Yeah, right. I think when you look back on Mike Griffin's time in space, one of the things that people will most like about his time as NASA administrator was his public-private partnership. He's the one that got SpaceX going. He's the one that saved SpaceX. Elon was like days from bankruptcy to hear him tell it. And NASA's COTS program, the public-private partnership, is what saved SpaceX. So Mike was really the genesis of the commercial cargo delivery and ultimately the human capsule that Boeing and SpaceX, and now hopefully our Orbital had a contract, Sierra Nevada. So those things came from Mike. And I think Jim Bridenstine has really continued that. That was his emphasis. He had a couple of different lunar lander commercial partnerships that he promoted. The idea of public-private partnership was a big part of his tenure as administrator. So I think that's important. NASA needs to figure out how to get money to the private sector, give them some basic marching orders, and then get out of their way. Find some program where that all the bureaucracy can focus on something over here that doesn't disturb the private sector and just let them get done what they need to get done. But then there's other things that only NASA can do. Make treaties with other nations, right? We need NASA for doing that. Nuclear power is going to be a part of any long-term human space exploration. SpaceX is not going to build nuclear reactors in space. That's going to have to be a government thing. So NASA needs to do what only the government can do, and the private sector needs to do what only the private sector can do, because NASA can't be innovative or agile. And if we both, it's just like a baseball team or a football team. If everybody does their job, then the team will work out well. So we need to continue what Mr. Bridenstine started, and focus on who does what well. And I think that's the key to the future.
You mentioned treaties. The Artemis Accords are an international agreement between the governments of participating nations based on the principles of cooperation and civil exploration for the use of the moon, Mars, comets, et cetera, for peaceful purposes, and is asserted to be grounded in the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. For the members of the audience, as I understand it, to date, the accords have been signed by 10 countries: the US, Australia, Canada, Japan, Luxembourg, Italy, United Kingdom, United Arab Emirates, Ukraine, and Brazil. What do you think about those Artemis Accords?
Well, I think it's great. I think it's a great first step. In the 60s was the first time we started to have the Moon Treaty and the Outer Space Treaty and so on. But it's not the 60s anymore. There's private companies getting involved. And so nations need to reinforce the basic understanding of here's how we're going to operate in space. Here's what we're not going to do in space. We're not going to turn into a nuclear war zone or anything like that. And I think one of the most important things that we need to promote is that companies can do commercial work in space and benefit from it. unless you can benefit from something, you're not going to put money into it, right? That's why we have IP. That's why we protect movies that Warner Brothers makes. If anybody could just, download it for free, then Warner Brothers wouldn't make cool movies. If drug companies couldn't sell drugs, then they wouldn't spend billions in research to make us new drugs. In the same way, there's not going to be a space economy unless companies can keep the materials they get from asteroids or whatever it is that they're doing in space. So I think things like the Artemis Accords are really important. I'll say this, I'm not sure if we have a question on it, but I'll just jump ahead if we do. I think the biggest accord that we need to come sign as an international community, and that we haven't yet, and it's one of the biggest threats to humanity, is about space debris. In fact, Greg and I have talked a lot about this, and we were on a panel a couple years ago talking about it. We have Space Force now, which I think makes sense, because space is not air, land, or sea. And that's sort of the equivalent of the Air Force. But there's no FAA equivalent to Space Force, right? Like you have the FAA and Air Force on Earth. You need an FAA in space to go along with Space Force to regulate space debris. And now that we're launching these massive constellations of 10,000 small satellites, those things are dangerous. They're not all going to deorbit themselves. We're going to end up with hundreds or probably thousands of satellites in orbit out of control. And eventually they're going to run into each other. And that debris is going to be there forever, because these constellations are not down at 200 kilometers. They're up at 500 and 1,000 kilometers. And those orbits are not orbits that decay. So the potential to make a mess that will be there forever, because you can't really clean up space debris. Physics doesn't allow that to happen cheaply, and not realistically, not at all. So that, I think that's probably the big, of all the accords that we need to sign, we need to figure out how to get space debris under control. That's not something that's happening. I've talked to people on the transition team. I talked to people in the previous administration at the absolute highest levels. They all agree it's a really big problem, and they all agree that nobody's doing anything about it because of this, because it's the government, right? And so that to me, that would be another top priority if I had any authority.
Well, I'm kind of envisioning Earth developing a thin ring like Saturn or Jupiter. It's scary.
It could be like the Neptune. You're right, exactly. When I was in space, when I was commander of the space station, I had to maneuver the space station to avoid debris that the Chinese had created in 2007 by a military anti-satellite demonstration. So they were beating their chest. Basically, they were saying, look what we can do, America, so be careful. They exploded the satellite. And now here it is 13 years later, that debris is still there. Like I said, I had to maneuver for it. Every year the station has to maneuver once or several times. The Russians had a satellite basically die, go out of control, and it collided with an Iridium satellite in 2010 or about a decade ago. That debris is still there. It's going to be there for decades probably to come. So space debris is a big deal. It's the biggest threat to humanity that we're not talking about, because if you make Earth orbit not available, that impacts humanity. It's a big deal.
Let me shift slightly. The lack of funding has been a continuous problem for space programs. Offhand, are there any particular ways we can do more in space with fewer dollars?
So I would argue that lack of funding is not the problem. NASA gets $22 billion a year. Going back to George W.'s administration, there's been a slight increase to NASA's budget every year, Republican and Democrat. NASA's getting money. They're spending a lot of it keeping the lights on at 10 different centers, so it's not necessarily efficient. They're spending a lot of it on, Senator X, Y, or Z's project that we have to spend money on. So that it's not necessarily the top line that is the problem with NASA's budget. It's the bottom line, kind of how we actually are able to spend it on useful projects. And we can sit here and wring our hands and say, well, we need to have better senators. Okay. Or we can say, all right, we have to be smarter and be innovative about it. And that's why companies like Blue Origin and SpaceX and Relativity and Made in Space and NanoRacks and TechShots and others are doing amazing things for much, much, much cheaper. And I think that's the private sector is going to be the hope. If we can figure out how to do public-private partnerships, that's going to be where really cool stuff happens in space.
Let me get to, I think, the crux of what we all thought about as children. If you were asked by the president or Congress, what space activities beyond Earth orbit ought to be our priorities and in what order, what would you answer?
I think I like to take the century-long view in foreign policy, in economic policy, and in space policy. And if I were doing that, I would say, what are we going to do in the 21st century? Well, we're going to send people to Mars. And then I would back that out as to how are we going to get to Mars? We're not just going to go to Mars. We didn't just go to the moon. We didn't have Apollo. We had Mercury and then Gemini and then Apollo. It was very much a build-up approach. And Apollo wouldn't have happened without Mercury and Gemini. And so I think we need to have a Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo to get to Mars. I think the space station is Mercury. We've shown that excuse me, we've shown that people can live and work in space for a long period of time. I think that the moon needs to be our Gemini. I think we can learn how to land on other planets. We can learn how to build habitat modules on the surface of another planet and operate nuclear power on the surface. And I think we need to learn how to operate kind of in a, I don't want to call it a cycler, but a transfer vehicle that takes us from here to the moon, and all the things that we're going to need on Mars, we ought to be testing out on moon. So when we come up with a moon program, we shouldn't say we're just going to go to the moon. We should say we're going to test and develop the technologies that we need for the future, so that we're not just doing things that don't really help us. So that would be my really long-term goal. And the rockets and the spaceships that we build would be made so that they could achieve that ultimate mission of getting to Mars.
Jeffrey, it's Bert. Sorry
Yep.
to interrupt the discussion. I just wanted to do a time check. We're at 12 minutes after 10 on the East Coast.
Yes.
And if Terry's willing, I think we could extend this to about 10:30, if that would be okay. I think everyone, we
Sure.
still have a lot of people. And also, just to let you know too, there are a lot of questions that were submitted through the Q&A. I think if we could take a look at some of those, that would be great.
I have. Well, during this quick break, one of them came as, Terry, what's the name of the children's book you're coming out with? Somebody want to know, and when will it be available?
It's still in flux. I think it's going to be Ask an Astronaut. I basically took 101 questions and wrote a short chapter, and it's going to be illustrated. It's probably not going to be for really young ages. It's going to be for kids who know how to read and can read a few paragraphs to answer each question. It'll be published next year. So 22. 21 is going to be first draft, second draft, getting illustrations and all that. It'll hopefully come out early next year. I'm not sure when the publisher is going to have it out. And the working title is Ask an Astronaut.
Okay, good title. I like that. Going back to the serious stuff about going to the moon and going to Mars, you mentioned building habitats there. I mean, do you envision basically going to the moon and Mars just to learn what's there, how to build tools, or do you envision people actually living there long term in settlements?
So you could build a base on the moon and have people live there. It's going to be expensive to operate that. And you certainly could build long-term habitats on Mars. I hope we do eventually. But the the problem is, I think both of those planets are always going to need, they're always going to be tied to Earth. Obviously the moon is, right? But Mars, even Mars, there's been this talk about terraforming Mars and so on. There's one really fundamental problem with Mars, and that is it doesn't have a magnetic field. So even if you took 1,000 years and you melted the ice caps and made an atmosphere, it wouldn't be 80% nitrogen and 20% oxygen, and B, it would get sucked away by the solar wind. And so Mars basically can't have an atmosphere of anything of any note. So I think both planets, Mars and the moon, are always going to require the astronauts to have spacesuits and spaceships, which kind of is a bummer for, it's like they're going to be in COVID lockdown permanently if they live there for a long period of time.
You know, it's funny. That's what I've been kind of thinking about the last 10 months. This would be like living in a Martian habitat.
Exactly. We're all doing training for a Mars mission.
Right. Put on my mask to go outside for a few minutes.
Yep.
So forth. Do you have any thoughts of how stage-wise we would develop presence on the moon?
How stage-wise we would do a presence on the moon?
Stage-wise, yes.
Yeah. So I would say, the first mission or two would be to show that, do an Apollo 8, do a lap around the moon, which is the planet Artemis, and then maybe land. I would send some robotic probes to find where we want to set up camp. And then I would set up camp. I would have modules that land on the moon. I would have another module that lands next to it, and it would have to robotically attach itself and level itself, right? If you got a RV trailer, you have to level it. And so there's just basic technologies that we've never done. At JSC, they had a really cool simulator that I had to fly right after before and after my space flight. It was really a balance check to see if I could do it, but I was driving habitats on Mars to dock with other habitats, which is a pretty cool test. But these kind of things that we're going to need on Mars, set up the recycling system for the air, for the water, for the food, get the nuclear power plant working. Mars does have a really thin carbon dioxide atmosphere. It's less than 1% of Earth's. So it's different than the moon. The dust on the moon is pretty nasty. It's like ground up glass. The dust on Mars, I think, is nasty, but it's not quite as bad. It depends on where you are. Mars is actually, the moon is different depending on where you land, but Mars is more different than the moon is. There's more heterogeneous and not as homogeneous as the moon is. So anyway, all those kinds of things that you would need on Mars, I think we ought to be practicing on the moon. The JPL calls it EDL, entry, descent, and landing, is going to be different on the moon than it is on Mars because you don't need a heat shield, obviously. But there's still going to be some similarities. The landing vehicle could be pretty similar to the one that we use on Mars.
It will be a while before Mars is a long-term habitat for people, but in the short run, the early missions, there's basically choices of two ways of getting there.
Right.
The short stay, so-called opposition class mission that would last 661 days, but with just 40 days on the ground before they have to come back, or the long stay conjunction class, which would last 905 days, but you'd have 545 of those days on the ground. What are the pros and the cons of each, and which would you currently favor, and why for the first mission?
So for me, it's the shorter duration is much better. There's a chapter in How to Astronaut that I wrote about this for several reasons. One is just economics. I did some basic math going on Wikipedia, and I divided mass on Mars by mission cost, and it's roughly $1 million a pound to go to Mars. And if you want to come back to Earth, add a zero. And so a year of existence for a human is hundreds or thousands of kilograms of stuff, of food. You can recycle air and water, but not 100%, so there's some cost there, of clothes, of spare parts. For a year, stuff breaks. And that extra, at $1 million a pound, that quickly becomes really expensive. And let's not forget, we just borrowed several $1 trillion to fight wars in Iraq, and several $1 trillion because of COVID. And it's all at 1% interest. In the coming decades, that interest rate may not stay at 1%. And so the extra money we're going to have to spend on projects like this is not going up, I don't think. So we have to really be conscious of costs when we talk about these missions. So a 2-year mission is a lot less than a 3-year mission as far as dollars. There's also the radiation budget, like how much radiation can an astronaut take? And when I was in space, I was below the Earth's magnetic field. You go 1,000 miles out or higher, and you're past the Van Allen radiation belts, and it's a lot worse for radiation. So a year of getting irradiated is a lot for a human being. So I think from a radiation point of view and a cost point of view and just size of the rocket point of view, 2 years is better than 3. I think personally that we should develop that nuclear power so that we have electric propulsion engines. And if you use like Franklin Chang Diaz's Vasimir engine or true electric propulsion, you could make this a 1-year mission. You could get there in 4, 5, 6 months, spend a month on the surface and come back. And I think that's probably what you want to do. A year and a half on the surface is a long time. Those spacesuits aren't going to last for 400 EVAs, right? They're going to last for 4 EVAs or 5 or 6 maybe or something. And so I think you'd wear out your spacesuits and then you'd be sitting you'd be sitting in your apartment in COVID lockdown for a year and a half, and landing on Mars would be amazing. That would be super cool. But looking at the same, red desert for a year there would be psychological problems for the crew, I would think.
Well, apart from propulsion, what do you view as the major technological obstacles that have to be addressed for any kind of long duration mission or permanent outpost?
Yeah, radiation is the elephant in the room. There's a couple different things you can do. You can get there faster and spend less time in radiation, or you can shield yourself from it. One way to shield yourself is to surround yourself with water. So you're going to need water in any space vehicle. So these vehicles that we send to the moon and Mars should have water in the shell, I think, to protect the crew. So I think that should be a design feature for Artemis, where we start just surrounding the vehicle in water. We need to do that now, so we're used to it forever. Water, lead would be better, but at $1 million a pound, we're not going to be launching lead. So that's one of them. I think having higher reliability and mean time between failure components. The carbon dioxide machine on the space station is called CEDRA. It's an amazing system. The space station recycling system is really cool. Designed at the Huntsville Marshall Space Flight Center. It's an amazing system. It takes basically air and water and urine and oxygen, and there's this recycling loop that is really cool. Sabatier reaction, which Bob Zubrin was a big fan of on Mars, because you got CO2 there. But it breaks. I spent an entire week working on that thing soon after I got to space. And then by the end of my 200-day mission, I spent another entire week working on it. So we, and A, that's time, which is one thing, but B, it's a lot of heavy, massive components that have to fix it. And if the CO2 machine breaks and you don't fix it, you die. If the toilet breaks and you don't fix it, you might die. And so we have to figure out how to make components. Maybe using a 3D printer might save mass. We have to make sure the 3D printer doesn't break. So figuring out just basic maintenance component, go to Ford or General Motors and ask them how they manage their mean time between failure program for auto components. The people who do that would probably be good people to ask for this.
The big giant in the room for a lot of people is the unanswered question is, for how long can humans survive, reproduce in less than Earth gravity, which we spent a million years getting accustomed to?
Right.
Are there any plans do you know of to build a variable gravity centrifuge in orbit?
Well, we have those. The ISS actually has those. They're small for blood. When we draw blood, we have a centrifuge. For doing rodent research or whatever, you can put biology samples in and do a half a G or 1 G or 2 Gs or whatever. So there is a small centrifuge for biology samples. To do the big, 2001: A Space Odyssey or Interstellar, or a lot of movies have the rotating space station. We just haven't done it. Basically, we looked at it in the 60s and we said it'll be cheaper to send them an exercise machine than it will be to have this complicated rotating space station. And they're right, actually. We don't need it on the ISS. I think you could send adults indefinitely into space, especially if they had the right relationships, Like if you could have families in space, you could go live for 50 years in space. It would be fine. But human development is not, I don't think, going to work. I don't think you want to have babies in weightlessness. No. I don't know. We've done that with animals, actually. So we need to do some more mammal research. But I think the big problem is going to be reproduction and raising kids. I think you're going to want to do that in the rotating part of the space station, not in the center part where it's weightless.
Right. I have two questions I want to get in before we leave, not to mention a lot of others back up. Would you fly in space again? And if so, under what circumstances and how and for what?
When I was leaving NASA, I was thinking, my boss said, hey, if you want to fly again, it's going to be 5 years. And I was still in my 40s. And I said, you know what? I'm energetic. I got all these things I want to do. I'm already in my 40s. I only have X number of years left. If I wait another 5 years and then a year of post-flight and then whatever and blah, 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 then I'll be in my 50s and I'll have less motivation. And I'd done everything. I was a shuttle pilot. I was a station commander. I'd done spacewalks. So I said it was time. It was a risk. You know, I had a government paycheck for 30 years, and I gave that up to a world where like you have to kill. If you don't kill, you don't eat, kind of thing. So it was risky, but it allowed me to do things that I want to do, like write books and speak and hopefully make some film and TV projects. But I'll never say never, especially with private space sector. In fact, a colleague of mine, Mike Lopez Alegria, just got announced that he's going to fly on a SpaceX with some private folks. So you never know if something like that comes up. The one thing I said, you know, if I could make a movie, I would come back here. I would love to come back and have my job to make a movie. So that's something that I would love to do, but we'll see. Who knows? You never know what's going to happen. But for now, I like what I'm doing, and I have no plans, but you never know.
Yeah. I just read that Axiom Space is sending 4 people up there at a mere $55 million a head. So that's all you need to raise.
I got to get my businesses going. I got to spend more time on business and less time on kids' books.
You know, we've talked about the things that we have to do to make progress on our road to space. Do you have any particular recommendations for what National Space Society or members of the public do that might accelerate the realization of our space visions?
You know, that's kind of an age-old question. I think, first of all, engage with each other and bounce ideas off of each other, and, you know, come up with plans that are meaningful and helpful, and then figure out a way to share those with companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin, or politicians like the NASA administrator and congressmen and senators. I know that National Space Society doesn't want to be necessarily a lobbying organization, but you know, that's where the bucks are. So, you know, no bucks, no Buck Rogers. And so if you could figure out ways to engage with both your members and also with, you know, members of the government, to let them know that, you know, this makes sense for getting to the moon or whatever, and helping them out. Because in my experience, and I've had a lot of time on the Hill with the House and the Senate, and I've visited, I don't know, 3 or 4 presidents, and some of them are very interested. They're very knowledgeable. The staffers know what's going on, and many of them have no idea. They're like, did you go to the moon? Or, you know, so that educating the folks that write billion-dollar checks is not a bad thing to do.
A couple of quick questions. This is right up your alley. An illustrator wondered, given the impact of your photography, what are your thoughts on the wow factor of space art?
Oh, I love space art. You know, my astronaut classmate, Nicole Stott, is kind of branded herself as the astronaut artist. She's a great artist. She paints. The late Al Bean from Apollo paints. And I tried to paint when I got back. My daughter was a good artist. She tried to show me how to paint, because the camera doesn't capture sunrises. I've got the sunrise up here, but the camera doesn't capture it quite right. And I tried and I sucked. So I'm going to stick to photography. But I think, you know, painting has a lot to say about a lot of things, not just space. But when it comes to space, when you see a really cool space painting, you know, you say, wow, it's really good. One of the things I liked about The Mandalorian, this show that just came in, at the end of every episode, they showed paintings of the episode, what had just happened. And those illustrations at the end of the show were in some ways cooler than the cinematography during the show itself.
Hey, gentlemen, sorry to interrupt. We're just at 10:30. I know the discussion is going really well, but it might be time to say goodnight to everybody. But there was a question that was submitted by a 9th grader from Romania. I don't know, Jeffrey,
wow.
if you'd like to read that one, or I certainly could read it. You see it, or want me to do it?
Yeah.
Okay, Terry, that's a 9th grader. Hello, I'm a 9th grader from Romania. And first of all, I wanted to thank you for this amazing conference. Now, speaking of Mars, we are all very excited about of Perseverance landing on February 18th. What are your expectations from this mission?
That is exciting. I think there's actually 3 spaceships, if I'm right. The Chinese have one, the UAE has one, and NASA has a lander going down. And I think it's just going to continue a couple of things. It'll continue the excitement for the whole world to see that we're going to Mars. and B, it'll help us continue to learn about the planet. There's a lot about the geology, about the history. If you want to talk about climate change, Mars had the ultimate climate change. They used to have liquid oceans, and we learned that through our rovers over the last decade. And now it's like drier than the driest desert on Earth. And so learning what and why that happened, looking for maybe any organic material we find in the soil. So there's still there's a lot of questions about Mars that we have. It's one of the coolest missions, frankly, is the UAE mission. It's the first ever Arab mission to Mars. It was designed and built by them in partnership with the University of Colorado. And I'm really excited about that. As for the region of the Middle East, it's something for them to be proud about. The whole Islamic community can look at that and say, wow, we built that. That's a really cool mission. They have an orbiter, and that's going to help the overall science community understand the Martian atmosphere. So there's some cool things happening at Mars in 2021 for sure.
Jeffrey, any final questions for Terry? One last one?
No, but just a big, great thanks for taking the time to speak with us. And I think it's been illuminating both for us who were in the know and those of us who thought we were in the know and those of us who weren't in the know. It's just most appreciative. I hope we can have you back time for a whole boatload of other questions we never got to. So that would be nice.
Well, thanks for having me. This is a great, it was like an hour and a half lightning round of questions. So thanks for having me.
And we have a lot more too. So
yeah.
we'll get you back. So again, thank you so much, Terry. We really appreciated taking the time. And Jeffrey, again, for just managing all of those questions and getting us through all of them so easily. It didn't seem like an hour and a half, but we really appreciated the effort. And so thank you. And thank you to Greg for the introduction. And also a thank you to our president, Jeffrey Notkin, for the welcome. And I want to just say thank you to Larry Ahern, who is the vice president of chapters, who with me has been coordinating all of these space forums, and he keeps doing such an amazing job. And also thank Fred Becker, for all his work on the technical side to manage things. We couldn't do this without you all. So we've had a great evening, a lot of questions. We've learned a lot of things. I want to thank all of our guests who joined us and all the participants. We had quite a few, and there's still a lot with us. So we hope to see you next time on the 11th for the next Space Forum, and also see you participating in the Space Settlement 2021 on February 4th. So on behalf of everyone with the National Space Society, I just want to say, wishing you all a good night. And I know we had a number of people in different time zones, so probably wishing you a good morning and a good day ahead. So take care, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Also,
Thanks,
bye-bye.
everybody.